Okay, so you've had a chance to look at Meryl Streep and see what she has to say about the making of a sweater. But that Devil Wears Prada clip, while it says something to us about the mass culture approach that Adorno and Horkheimer talked about, also introduces us into, wittily enough, what I call the production of culture approach. So we've called the whole week production of culture. But by the 1970s, there was really kind of a specific movement within sociology that you could point to as the production of culture approach. And the basic interest of this approach was to look at objects, so objects of mass society, like a blue sweater, and to ask, where does that come from? How is it that that particular blue sweater gets made? And not just made in the sense of like the factory that made it, but looking at a whole system of interrelationships, a network of relationships that produce that sweater. So I want to talk just a little bit about this approach. This takes us far away from a Marxist approach in the sense that it's really kind of looking at the object. It's not looking so much in terms of the function of this whole system of mass culture, but instead it's looking how an object within mass culture is produced and what that tells us about the production of cultural objects. So in some ways we're away from the pessimism of kind of the Marxist approach, and we're getting away from the overarching look at this is what culture does in the Marxist approach to how is it that a particular cultural object of mass society actually appears. So this approach, like I mentioned, is the 1970s. They use kind of formal sociological methods, so you can actually read a lot of studies in sociology journals and sociology books. And they're trying to do they're trying to make 2 points really about how cultural objects are produced. They're trying to get us out of what's called the great individual mode of explaining culture, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but they're trying to get us out of that, so I put an X through that. And they're trying to get us out of simple supply, demand, economic-driven explanations of how cultural objects appear. So they're trying to get rid of that too. So I wrote them up here, but as you notice, I put a slash through them because I'm saying this approach, the production and culture approach, is trying to reform that. So let's go with an example. A guy named Howard Becker wrote a whole book, literally a whole book, on basically how a piece of art gets made. And what Becker wanted us, was saying was that usually when, and I'm going to draw here so I'll zoom in a little bit, usually when people talk about a great work of art, like a Van Gogh, I'm a huge fan of Van Gogh, they talk about the art world was going along, and then holy crap, all of a sudden Van Gogh appears. And Van Gogh is the peak of a mountain. So most artists are just kind of toiling along down here, but voila, Van Gogh appears. He takes this to complete new heights. He clearly was a genius. How else would we have known so much about his work and been so aware of his work? And what Howard Becker wants to say is, you know, that's probably not the best explanation for how a great work of art or any work of art appears. There's got to be a more complex system going on behind it. And actually, if you know anything about Van Gogh, you know that when he died, he kind of died in anonymity and in quite a sad way, and his work was really worth not much of anything the moment he died. So keep that in the back of your mind. Let's use fashion as an example to get a sense of where a cultural object comes from. So let's think about a blue sweater. Now, I'm a horrible drawer, so you're going to have to bear with me, but that is clearly a blue sweater. And Howard Becker comes along and he tells us, well, what all goes into making this blue sweater? So instead of seeing the blue sweater as a high point of fashion, he wants to see it as this kind of meeting point, this intersection point of a whole network of forces. And we have things like suppliers. So suppliers are the people, oftentimes in developing countries, that weave the materials or dye the materials. Or in the case of Los Angeles, one of the great industries of Los Angeles were literally sweatshops of sewers who, in a moment's notice, could sew a whole new pattern and could pump out a whole bunch of new blue sweaters if the order was put in. We also have what are called gatekeepers. These are people who make taste. So they're taste makers too. These are big names in the field who agree to put their name on a new piece of clothing, say Michael Kors, for example, or Kenneth Cole. But they're also people who agree to show off new fashion colors or ideas. So stars, J-Lo and Jay-Z and anybody else with the J at the beginning of their name who TMZ will cover. So these are crucial to actually getting a cultural object to become popular, to influence mass society. And then we have people that make audiences. So we'll call these audience producers. So these are the forces that help to get the good opinions of the gatekeepers out there. So these are things like a show like the Jersey Shore that would just have that blue sweater show up quite a bit so that it starts to be in our mentality. Or these would be things like TMZ or magazine that all of a sudden would start showing like, wow, isn't it interesting that all the hot people in town seem to be wearing a blue sweater these days. And then finally we have kind of what you could call the social conditions that go behind the blue sweater. So these are the fact that there are fashion schools out there that train people to cut and to design and to sew. These are the fashion festivals like Bryant Park, which is the high point of, if you're a fan of Project Runway like I am, it's the high point of every Project Runway season is, woo, a chance to show in Fashion Park, or Bryant Park. And even though most of those clothes are never worn, it's the styles and the cuts and the colors and stuff that show up. So there's this whole series of kind of fashion fairs and fashion festivals that exist to do this. There's close linkages between the music scene and the fashion scene. Here in Los Angeles, there's parts of town where you go to a club, but you're not really just going to the club to hear the music. You're going to see what other people are wearing and what's hot and what's new. And then you might kind of incorporate that into your wardrobe as you go about your business. So Howard Becker helped us to see that there's all these various forces that go into the production of that sweater. So it was not just a sweater like a work of art, like a mass cultural object is not the peak of a mountain, but is actually the center of a network of things. And if you take away any one of these things, then what seems natural as the popularity that seems natural of that blue sweater or of that great work of art actually disintegrates. So what Howard Becker helped us to see was that the popularity, the use in mass culture of any particular cultural object is not based on some inherent goodness about this particular object, but is based in the network of conditions and that enable that product to even be made. And what we see here also then from this school, the production of culture school, is that demand side and supply side explanations don't necessarily work well. And I'll give you another example. There's this great sociologist by the last name Peterson, who wrote a really cool article, which is, why did rock music explode in 1955? And the way most people tell it is that it was either a demand or supply story. So people say, oh, it was the demand. The baby boomers, they were really into this new vision of what it meant to be American and cool, and so they really wanted rock and roll music. Or people would say things like, well, with supply, you had, just think of Elvis's hips. You put, a guy up there shaking his hips, and you realize that there's all these great rock musicians out there who have somehow learned killer licks on the new guitars that are coming out, and so you just had this boom in rock music supply. And what Peterson showed was that actually neither of those were true. The baby boomers in 1955 were only about 9 years old, so there's no way that baby boomers were driving the demand for rock and roll. And there were actually, at any given moment, there's tons of Elvises. There's billions of Elvises right now, potentially, in our local community in the United States. So there's always a supply of creative art. It's just the narrative of rock and roll history that says somehow this point, early 1950s, was this unique time when the best musicians in the 20th century lived. That's actually not true. Peterson shows that that's not true. The demand explanation is not true. So what is true? Well, much like Howard Becker, Peterson traces a whole bunch of different changes that go into making rock and roll. For example, the advent of the 7-inch record. So 7-inch vinyl made it much easier to pump out tons of music. Instead of putting a whole record on, or a whole album on one big record, you could put one song and just pump it out to the music stores. You have changes in radio station law, which basically open the spectrum of radio so that more radio stations could get on. And what did they do in order to compete? Well, they were willing to put on all sorts of new local artists that were playing new music. You have cheap radios because of transistors, especially transistors that are beginning to be mass-produced in Asia. And you think of Japan and the rise of entertainment technology. And you also have changes in industry structure. So you have a couple of breakaway groups that are basically trying to break into the big media monopolies and are willing to sign artists that nobody's ever heard of and give it a shot as a way to try and get into industry. So you have this whole host of changes, again, much like a network that I drew before, and how it's the conditions of all these various pieces of the network that come together to produce changes. So the simple narratives that we sometimes tell ourselves about how a piece of popular culture gets produced, that it's a brilliant, great artist person, that it's supply, that it's demand. Actually, as sociologists, we know it's usually a heck of a lot more complex than that. So let me wrap up with a few thoughts here. We started the lecture by talking about Gramsci's conception of hegemony and how common sense is a way that a dominant force of capitalist culture can kind of keep reproducing its beliefs in culture. And this view is mostly kind of a cynical view about the power of culture, but it says very little about the actual contents of culture. Then we went to Adorno and Horkheimer, who are much more willing to look at the contents of culture, what they would have seen as bad television, bad movies, bad art, and they bring in some of that critical is a very important word, critical vision from the Marxists, but they don't tie it so much to the overarching capitalist moment. Instead, they tie it to corporations that need to turn a profit. And then they trace some really negative things that are a result of this move towards mass culture, homogenous, boring, lowest common denominator culture. And then finally we move to this production of culture vision that dumps a little bit of the critical commentary of the earlier ones and wants to look at all the systems that go into producing one particular cultural object. We see through all three of those that looking at mass culture is important in a class such as ours because we start to get a sense of how culture can kind of work in relation to other parts of society. And as we go forward through, of course, it's good to have kind of in our background where this thing that oftentimes people talk about when they talk about mainstream culture, where that comes from sociologically. So as a way of wrapping up, I gave you the article on television from Pierre Bourdieu, which is a great marrying together of these approaches. He looks at how a television show, how the particular narrative of a television show comes to be. So he's looking at the object of a television show, like debates on a television show and that sort of thing. But then he also looks at what occurs because of the way modern mass media is. In other words, what are the implications of the fact that the cultural object of television looks the way it does? So he's very much like Gramsci and Adorno in that sense, trying to get a sense of what culture does to us because of the way it is in a mass culture society. So I'll leave it at that. I covered a lot of ground this week, but I tried to do it kind of quickly in this lecture for you. Have a little fun with those readings. I opened it a little bit to allow you to go where you wanted with the readings and to think about what this mass culture thing does to us in our world today. That's it. Have a good week. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.